So in yesterday's game against UTSA, Texas quarterback Quinn Ewers ended up getting hurt and he missed most of yesterday's game. Arch Manning came in, dominated, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on, as well as give you guys an update on Quinn Ewers. But before we get into that, let's talk about the new AP ranking. Texas has officially jumped Georgia for the spot, and I think this makes a ton of sense. You know, when you look at that Georgia-Kentucky game, it was brutal for Georgia. Honestly, Georgia is a much better team than Kentucky. I expected a win by more than 3 touchdowns, and I was very, very shocked to see that Kentucky had a chance at the end of the game. They literally had the football with time on the clock. Obviously, they weren't able to do much on the offensive side, but Kentucky did a phenomenal job being able to handle Georgia, and I was shocked as hell to see that. But with that, they also fall down one spot in the ranking, although they didn't actually lose. And Texas is now, for the first time in 16 years, ranked the #1 team in the country. Texas is incredible this year, man. You know, I've watched college football for such a long time. I've analyzed offensive and defensive line at the moment for the Hula Bowl. But even before that, for such a long time, I would analyze offensive and defensive linemen for just the NFL draft process. And one of the things I would always see is the best teams in the country would have the best O-line, the best D-line. They'd have a great quarterback and weapons. And what you would generally see from the teams that were winning, Texas basically has that now. They got arguably the best left tackle in the country in Kelvin Banks Jr. They have a great center in Jake Majors. They have a couple of playmakers in Isaiah Bond and Ryan Wingo. They have a phenomenal backup quarterback in Arch Manning that we'll talk about here in a second. But just from top to bottom, man, Steve Sarkisian's done a phenomenal job with this team. There's depth on this team. They're coached well. This team knows how to win football games. To me, I think Texas is probably the best team in the country at the moment. And if they're not the best, they're one of the 2 or 3 best. And I think they're going to definitely be competing for a championship this year. And I think they have a real shot to beat Georgia. And I'd make the argument Georgia's the only team in the country that could beat Texas. And I would only say that because Georgia has a great defensive line, which is something that I've actually talked about with Texas that I felt like they needed to improve. We'll touch on that here in a second as well. But the AP ranking, you know, has been changed, and I'm excited to kind of see what happens as we go forward. You know, Texas has a couple of easy games coming up, but they got Georgia and Oklahoma in a couple of weeks, right? They'll get Oklahoma a week before Georgia. But those 2 games right there are going to be huge, huge, huge games, especially depending on what happens with the Tennessee-Oklahoma game coming up. So Tennessee right now is ranked as the #6 team in the country. If Oklahoma beats Tennessee, Oklahoma is going to be a top 10 ranked team. If not top 10, they'll be top 12 to 15. And, you know, never sleep on Oklahoma either. So Texas is going to have a couple of interesting games coming up in a couple of weeks. But let's get right into the Quinn Ewers news, man. To me, Quinn Ewers is a fantastic quarterback, and it's kind of crazy and it's kind of unfortunate that this is kind of happening. But because Arch Manning is such a, you know, he's so, you know, and hype's not the right word, right? But because he has so much, you know, he has so much popularity, right? He's one of the most highly rated prospects at that position because of who his uncles and his father is. Arch Manning has essentially become the most hyped prospect in the country, and it's for good reason. Yesterday, when Quinn Ewers went down, Arch Manning came in and instantly just came in and dominated, right? He went on to have a phenomenal game. 9 of 12, 223 yards, 4 touchdowns, and he looked really, really good against UTSA. And some people are now saying that, you know, with Arch Manning essentially taking over for Quinn Ewers, is there a chance that Arch Manning actually ends up starting as we go forward? Is there a chance that he just ends up taking the job over? You know, I'll be the first to tell you guys, Quinn Ewers he's been a really good quarterback in his own right. All right, when I put his tape on it, it's very clear this guy has it. I think Quinn Ewers can end up being a top 10 pick in the NFL draft. And I also think that right now, Quinn Ewers gives Texas the best chance to win the championship. Arch Manning looked really, really good yesterday. But Arch Manning is still inexperienced. And I think playing UTSA is one thing, but, you know, when you're going to be taking on a team in a couple of weeks like Oklahoma, it might be different. If it's a team like Georgia, that might be different. You'll also have Kentucky, right? I think it's like the second to last game of the season. Kentucky almost beat Georgia yesterday, right? So they might actually be a good team. You got Texas A&M at the end of the season. Not saying Texas is not going to win all of those games, but to me, Quinn Ewers has played at the highest level, right? He has that experience. Arch Manning does not have that experience yet. Although he looked incredible, and I'm sure he'll be ready to go when that time comes next year, I'm not sure if he's ready to take over at this point. Now, fortunate for Texas, Quinn Ewers' injury is not season ending. It's not going to keep him out for 6 to 8 weeks. At this point, according to Pete Thamel, the injury is week to week, but according to what he says Quinn Ewers' abdominal injury isn't as serious as initially feared. He's likely to miss the Louisiana Monroe game this week, but it's week to week after leaving the UTSA game. So essentially, he should be back, right? So there is not a set timetable at this point, but it's not a long-term injury, and Quinn Ewers should not be out more than maybe 2 games. Come Oklahoma, he should be good to go, right? Oklahoma is going to be on October 12th, so there's still a lot of time left up until that point. You have 2 games before that. But that October 12th game against Oklahoma and then that Georgia game the following week are going to be the 2 most important games of the season for Texas. If Texas somehow drops both of those games, you're going to fall down the listing. They're not going to, right? I think they're going to end up beating Oklahoma. And then it'll be a very, very good matchup against Georgia. And honestly, that Oklahoma and Georgia game, we might even see those teams playing Texas again come playoff time, right? So we'll see what ends up happening. I'm very, very excited to kind of see what Arch Manning does do, though, coming up here against Monroe. Obviously, Monroe's not a great team, but the Mississippi State game the following week should be a little bit of a better matchup if he does end up playing in that game as well. Plus, the fact that you have about 3 weeks until that Oklahoma game, it does let Quinn Ewers get fully healthy. Let's talk about the game a little bit more in detail from yesterday. We saw a couple of players stepped up. There were a couple of keys that I needed to kind of see that I felt like if Texas wants to show themselves that, or Texas wanted to show that they're generally speaking, top 5 team, they can hang with the big boys in the Alabamas, the Georgias. They had to fix certain things within their trenches. All right, I talked about their offensive line in the past, but one of the things I needed to see from them this week was I needed to see the defensive line step up. Michigan has a okay offensive line, right? It's pretty good, but their offensive line is by no means as good as Oklahoma or Georgia, at least in my opinion. And the one thing I needed to see with Texas was I needed to see some of their defensive players step up and generate pressure. And yesterday against UTSA, we saw that. Freshman defensive end Colin Simmons, phenomenal game. Absolute monster, man. You can already see the upside with this kid. I think he was one of the top 10 prospects coming out of this past year's cycle. The guy was phenomenal, and I see why Texas wanted this kid. He had a sack, a quarterback pressure. He had multiple quarterback pressures. He had a couple of run stops, but he got after the quarterback, right? And to me, that's what Texas needs. After losing the big boys they lost last year, they needed some guys to potentially step up this year, and I felt like over the first 2 weeks, they didn't really show me that their defensive line would be able to, play as well as they did last year. And I'm still not 100% sure that this defensive line will be able to, hang with some of those top tier offensive lines. But Simmons at least looked good to me. We got Leon Leofau also had a sack, and I think it was another sack by one of the linebackers. So there were about 3-4 sacks by Texas defensive line or front seven, and then on top of that, they had multiple pressures to the quarterback. I felt like the defensive line had the best game of their season against UTSA. And we also got to keep in mind, rust is a real thing, and I think sometimes people kind of overlook that aspect of things. But rust is a real thing. Usually by week 3 to 4, you start to really understand what a team is or not. And again, with Texas, I felt like I needed to see that offensive line and that defensive line show me that they are good enough to hang with the big boy teams, right? The Oklahomas, the Georgias. I'm not saying Texas is not a big boy team, but I needed Texas's offensive and defensive line to really show me that they're going to be able to hold their own, and they've shown that, all right, for the most part this year. I think Texas is one of the best offensive lines in the country. Even their right tackle, Cameron Williams, has looked really, really good to me. I think he's given up 1 sack on the season so far. Don't quote me on that. He might not have, but he's looked really good. And then Kelvin Banks, top 10 pick in the NFL draft, right? Phenomenal player. Jake Majors is probably going to be a top 3 or 4 round guy as well. He's really, really good as well. And then, the offensive line did their thing. Another thing I needed to see was I needed to see which linebacker for Texas would step up and make a couple of plays. I felt like the linebackers have been good at times, but they've also given up some chunk plays. Anthony Hill Jr. had a fantastic game yesterday. He was all over it. Cornerback Jada Barron also had a really, really good game. Barron, I feel like, is a little overlooked because he's a fifth-year player. But Barron's looked really good as well, right? He's been getting after it. He had an interception, I believe, against Colorado State in week 1. To me, I think Texas is legit. Some of those players are starting to step up and show us a little bit more. We're going to see a lot coming up in this next week. We got Tennessee versus Oklahoma. I think that's going to be a key matchup because if Oklahoma beats Tennessee, they're going to climb the ranks. They might end up being a top 10 team. And then you'll get one more week until essentially Oklahoma, Texas play, right? Or actually, it's a 2-week gap between the Mississippi State and the Oklahoma game, which is nice because Texas will have 2 weeks to kind of get ready for that game. I should also mention from the UTSA game, Jarrett Gibson looked really, really good. So hats off to him. 13 carries, 75 yards, averaged about 5.8 yards per attempt. Arch Manning came in, looked really, really good as well. And I hope the criticism earlier isn't, it's not negative towards Arch Manning, right? I don't want to criticize him and then for you guys to think I'm being negative towards him. At the end of the day, for Arch Manning, he has to come out and prove himself first and foremost. And it's one thing to play UTSA. It's a completely different thing to play, Kentucky or Georgia or whatever other team it is. And Arch Manning had a great game yesterday, right? He was absolutely on fire. He only had 3 incompletions. He had multiple big-time passes downfield. He was creating with his legs. Like, everything Arch Manning was doing yesterday was really, really, really impressive for me to watch. I want to see this team continue to dominate the way they have been kind of dominating. The Michigan game was one of those games that really impressed me. I thought that game would have probably been a little bit closer. That Michigan game to me proved that Texas is one of the top teams, right? They dominated Michigan, and Michigan's pretty good, right? I know, last year to this year is a completely different team, but Michigan's still a good football team. I think Michigan going forward, they're going to win a lot of games. I think they're going to be ranked fairly high by the time the season comes to an end. But yeah. So let me know what you guys think, man. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. What are your guys' thoughts on the offensive line? What are your guys' thoughts on the defensive guys? Are there guys that you need to see more from or units that you need to see more from? One of the things I actually did not realize coming into the season was how good Texas's playmakers would be. I knew they had guys that were legit. I knew there'd be guys that might have some, it might be a little bit of learning curve with some of these guys. They have to kind of, be able to come back, step up, and have a little bit of success. But like guys like Jonte Cook, right? I think he had 2 touchdowns yesterday. He's one of those guys that, not saying I didn't expect a lot from him, and he hasn't been going crazy anyways, but like you can just tell he's a solid playmaker, right? He does his job. He makes those plays. Matthew Golden's a guy that I think some people might have slept on a little bit. And then, of course, Ryan Wingo, Isaiah Bond have been incredible this year so far. Even Gunnar Helm has looked really good, right? He had a catch for 49 yards yesterday. But there's a lot of playmakers on Texas, right? So I feel like one of the things I didn't recognize early on is how good some of those playmakers are, how deep they are at some of those positions as well, right? So let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure to drop a comment down below. Subscribe if you are not subscribed, and I will see you guys next time with another video.